Hello, and welcome to The Mind of a Therapist, a podcast where I interview psychotherapists and helping professionals and what they're passionate about in order to provide you with messages of encouragement and hope. I'm your host, Andrew Earle. The Mind of a Therapist is sponsored by Psychological Counseling Services, healing hearts and transforming lives. Look into our intensive at pcsearle.com. In today's episode, I interviewed Taylor Aasand. Taylor is a certified eating disorder specialist and registered dietitian nutritionist. She's dedicated her career to counseling and pursuing policy change around weight stigma and eating disorder care in Arizona. As a certified intuitive eating counselor and having trained with Evelyn Tribole, one of the authors of Intuitive Eating, she enjoys working in partnership with clients to help them heal their relationships with food, exercise, their bodies, and by extension, themselves. So without further ado, here's my interview with Taylor. All right, Taylor, thanks for taking the time to be on the podcast today. The first question I generally ask guests is, how do you view change? What does it take for someone to change, maybe specifically around their relationship with food, eating disorders, or just what's your general take on change?
And thank you for having me. It's such a pleasure to be here, and even just bringing awareness to like the work I do and the patients or clients that I serve. I also love that question. I've never really been asked that question in that way. And I think part of me used to think it would be willingness on the client's or patient's part. And I've turned my view on that 180 degrees. And a lot of that is because of what I've been able to do with the PCS intensive. Sometimes I meet with clients who are almost like, what the heck am I doing meeting with a dietitian? And by the end of the session, they're like, wow, I've never really even maybe thought of something in that way, or thought my relationship with food was maybe problematic or concerning. There was an instance where I was working with someone who was, almost in retirement age, and they had never been able to really identify themselves as struggling with an eating disorder until that conversation, which I found incredibly impactful and profound. So I sometimes think that when the right people have a really important conversation together, that can kind of open up the possibility for change or reflection.
Yeah, well, that makes sense. And I think I'm so glad that you're on the PCS team and part of the intensive, because for a lot of us, we don't think about food. We don't think about the impact food has on our physical, and probably more so people think about the impact it has on their physical health, but not as much on our mental health. And I know for myself personally, I don't know if you know, but my wife's a nutritionist. The listeners will know that. And
yes,
yeah, and so I have been lucky enough to, I've learned from her and really shifted the way that I ate. And I didn't think I was doing it to treat stomach issues that I had, but it ended up really impacting my mental health as well and my energy levels. So curious, when you're talking with people, how does, we're talking about eating disorders, how do we define what is disordered eating? How do we define what is not disordered eating? Could you give, I know this is a bit, there's a lot that falls under what an eating disorder is, but will you kind of give us an overview there?
Yes, I love that question. I also love that your wife, that's absolutely right, is a nutritionist, and you kind of are almost, you get to see the importance and the benefits and be with someone who's so passionate about the importance of food, which is great. Disordered eating. I mean, right now we have statistics that about 80 to 90% of American adults struggle with disordered eating.
Really?
Yeah. And my definition of that is basically doing things with food that take away from your life and living it the way that you want to.
Mm.
That can be as simple as, going or cooking with your kids and feeling so stressed out about the food that they're cooking. Maybe it's cookies or a cake, that you're not even willing to eat something that they're offering to you. Or maybe you're constantly tracking calories or macros and it's distracting from your personal life. And then, of course, these behaviors can get more serious and fall into the lens of an actual eating disorder, which, we would reference the DSM-5 on what that could look like. But usually it could be something like severe caloric restriction, could be binging and purging, could be having extreme medical consequences on your health and your physical being. But it's really a gray area. Because all of a sudden, I feel like the line can be so thin and even dashed or dotted, where someone's like, oh, I'm just doing this chronic dieting or yo-yo cycling or kind of doing weird crap with food. And then all of a sudden it takes on a life of its own, where the food and your relationship with it is controlling you. And that's kind of, from my personal experience, what I would define an eating disorder as is like, oh, wow, you're no longer in control here. You're no longer making the decisions. They're kind of being made for you.
Yeah, that makes sense. So the line where you would classify an eating disorder would be, I no longer feel like I'm in control here. I feel like whatever the eating disorder is has kind of taken over.
Yes. Yes.
And how does body image fit into certain eating disorders? Will you speak a bit to that?
Yeah, absolutely. So there's actually one criteria of eating disorders that have nothing to do with body image, and all of the other ones do. And that would be an eating disorder called RFID, or avoidant restrictive food intake disorder. That one's usually linked to like sensory issues or very specific food preferences. However, weight or body image or the perception of our physical body has nothing to do with the behaviors. So in that instance, right, it's could be, right, we wouldn't even have to work on that piece. In all other cases, body image is huge. And some eating disorder professionals, in my opinion, might say things like, well, body image is the last piece to go when it comes to treatment or recovery. And I totally disagree with that notion, because it can be absolutely distressing and scary trying to heal your relationship with food and not knowing how your body's going to respond to that. So I always try to prioritize both the nutrition rehabilitation and the body image piece, because most of the time, body dissatisfaction is what leads us down this disordered eating disorder path. And then, of course, like we mentioned, it'll just take on this vicious life of its own. And then we're in a really, really scary place. So
Yeah.
I hope that answered the question.
Oh,
I'm
it
not sure.
does. Yeah, thank you. And I think I heard in grad school a while back that anorexia, for example, disproportionately affects women, and it makes sense in our society that is hypercritical of the female body, also the male body, but in
Yeah.
particularly we see the objectification of the female body all over. And so will you speak a bit to the role that gender and that focus on the physical body has in this development of eating disorders?
Oh, I would love to. Such a great question. So statistically speaking, women are more likely to be diagnosed with anorexia nervosa. And for anyone who's listening who might not know what that is, that's where we are engaging in caloric restriction well underneath what your body needs to survive. And with that can just be rules around food, maybe meal skipping, calorie tracking, those types of things. What's interesting is when we think about eating disorders, or at least I can say from my perspective and the people I work with, we were kind of trained to think of like a thin, young, white, emaciated female. And what we know now is that maybe represents about 5 to 6% of people who struggle with an eating disorder. So there's this huge category of people or number of people who might not look sick, who are struggling with the exact same things. We have this diagnosis now called atypical anorexia, which makes people cringe because someone could be doing the exact same behaviors, but their body might not match that visual that we were kind of trained to see. And we're learning more about that as we kind of study, the effects of human starvation, genetics, how bodies are just different and are going to respond to the same behaviors in a different way. But because society places so much pressure on women particularly, we might, struggle with these disorders or disordered eating behaviors. And for whatever reason, men might struggle with it too, but they don't have the safe communities to maybe express this is what they're struggling with. So, right, like physicians or other health professionals might not even feel comfortable screening men or even people of different races and genders. So it's a whole mess.
Yeah.
But complicated, like all things are.
Yeah, absolutely. And the stereotypes there I'm hearing get in the way of diagnoses being made for men or for people with bodies that one wouldn't stereotypically,
100%.
view as anorexic or.
Yes. But man, we are so critical on, I feel like, everyone's body and how it should look, right? And because diet culture wants to make money off of us, 5 years ago it was one type of body, and now we're, trying to move on to the next, and it's impossible to keep up with. And I like to tell my clients it's made that way by design. If you are satisfied with your body, how am I supposed to make money off you?
Yeah. I mean, there's a huge industry in diet culture, isn't there, with what is sold. Yeah.
It's crazy.
Yeah. Are there other pieces to the development of eating disorders, disordered eating, such as, I mean, what I would guess is traumatic, painful experiences? Food could be kind of a coping mechanism and soothing. I know for me growing up, my relationship with sugar, like I mentioned, I've done some eating protocols where I completely cut out sugar, and it's amazing the addictive. I mean, I was dreaming about donuts. But it was. I think for me there has been a level of coping with sugar in particular, and starchy foods, to kind of soothe anxiety, to soothe emotional pain. So I would guess that, I see you nodding your head. Seems like that's true for people. Would you speak more to that, and then other pieces that may contribute to, disordered eating disorders?
Yes, I love that question, and thank you for sharing your experience, because it's so relatable. So sometimes clients might say the exact same thing. Like I struggle with these foods. I feel like maybe I'm obsessed. Maybe I'm dreaming about them. Maybe I think about them all the time. And that can be really, really common. With a lot of clients, I ask them this question. Okay, tell me what your childhood was like in terms of food and nutrition, and were there expectations or were there rules? Sometimes it can start with something as simple as like the clean your plate club. And by that, I mean, being forced to have a family dinner, which family dinners are fabulous and great. But it can be stressful knowing you need to eat the food on your plate in order to maybe have dessert or whatever. And consequently, we then put those foods on a pedestal, right? I have to eat this maybe not so great food, and then I can have a brownie or whatever. And so eating disorders in general are kind of like these perfect storms. So some kids, that might be their experience, totally fine. Sneak a few brownies, nothing else happens. But some people might experience shame around that. Maybe they're eating past fullness. Maybe it's affecting their body image. Maybe they start hiding food because they don't want to eat everything on their plate. And it can just create this host of kind of like distress in terms of their relationship with food. And so childhood can be incredibly influential. And then let's say we do have a traumatic life experience. Maybe there's a separation, maybe there's abuse in the home. We're already learning that brownies or the carbohydrates or the glucose in the brownie affects our brain chemistry, and we release hormones that make us feel good because of that. So it's this like perfect marriage of, oh yeah, this food is on this pedestal and it makes me feel really awesome. And that is kind of usually one of our first self-taught coping mechanisms. You know, I've had clients as young as like 5 years old identify that, oh, I was just in the pantry eating with the door closed, you know, and it's like, makes sense, right? So I think validating all of the ways and paths we can get to our current relationship with food, you know, how our parents' relationship with food impacted us, were we forced on diet as a kid? All of these things can affect our relationship or our affinity towards those foods. And then just acknowledging that it changes our brain chemistry. Like it makes us feel good. We get little dopamine hits every time we do it. So usually if we're trying to work on that or address it, I never tell anyone to cut those foods out. In my experience, deprivation is the biggest predictor towards binge behavior, but we might focus on, hey, are you getting all the other things your body needs? And that usually is pretty well received.
Wow. I really appreciate that focus on looking at our relationship with food. What were our parents' beliefs on food? What experiences did we have with food from an early age? And I mean, it's just kind of crazy the amount of sugary foods that give us that neurochemical rush, and it's around every corner. It's not fair. It's so hard. It's so hard for me to make these shifts in my life away from sugar, because it's just everywhere. It's such a part of social, and so I'm hearing you like restriction right off the bat is generally not a useful strategy. What sort of strategies are helpful for people in like making shifts towards eating foods that their bodies feel good with, or in the case of someone with anorexia or an eating disorder, eating the amount of calories that their body needs?
Yeah,
that's a big question.
It's it's a great question, and arguably one of the most important questions. So I'm glad you're asking it. So Andrew, I am a registered dietitian and eating disorder specialist and a intuitive eating counselor. And that's a bunch of just words that mean different things. But I practice from an intuitive eating lens. And intuitive eating, some people have heard of it before and they might associate it with, oh, you just mean eat when you're hungry and stop when you're full. And I would say that's the diet culture co-opted message or summary of intuitive eating. But really, it was this incredible framework created by these two dietitians back in the mid-90s. And they basically came up with this concept because they were sick and tired of giving people meal plans that were kind of restrictive, prescriptive. They'd send their clients on their way. The clients would call them back, months later saying something like, I failed the plan. I need to come see you again. Almost kind of like how we view diet culture now. It's like all of these programs and plans that people are just finding not very sustainable. So intuitive eating in the truest form is this 10 principle self-care framework when it comes to food. And what's great about it is there's the 10 principles. They range from anything from rejecting diet culture to finding movement that you enjoy to honoring your health with gentle nutrition. And several others in between. And we can start what at the place that makes the most sense for the client or the patient. So let's say someone's priority is, hey, I just need a nutritional tune-up. Great, we can kind of look at gentle nutrition and what that would look like for that person. Maybe someone's really, really struggling with an eating disorder like anorexia, and we need to nutritionally rehabilitate and maybe even weight restore that patient. We might start in terms of like rejecting the diet mentality or those eating disorder thoughts and coupling that with a more prescriptive meal plan out of medical necessity. So what's great about it is the overall idea is to help people connect with their bodies and what feels good. So to kind of speak to what we were talking about with sugar, if someone's telling me, Taylor, I just can't eat this stuff, I don't want to, I'm not going to force you to do that. I might say, hey, is that like in line with our goals? Or is this going to be problematic in the future? Are we going to be binging on Oreos at night? Like what do we need to account for? And I think some people can be really, really receptive to almost feeling like they're in control of their treatment with this kind of approach. Because I'm kind of like, hey, you're in the driver's seat. I'm just right next to you. And I'm here to offer my advice and sprinkle in my expertise, but I'm here to support you along the way. So if you haven't heard of intuitive eating, it's fantastic. And they've updated the book about 4 times. Most recently, they came out with a copy about 1.5 years ago with just updated literature and research. I think there's over 200 studies to date, just like supporting its purpose in the eating disorder recovery field. So I just can't speak enough about it.
Well, I'm drawn to what you're saying there with really supporting the client and being in the driver's seat. This is your process, and I'm going to offer suggestions. The expertise that I have, but this is your process, and how the psychotherapy models that I think are helpful for people do that. They put the person in the center of that change process. And well, you were talking about with someone who's calorie restricting, maybe they reject diet culture. Would you say more about what that process could look like for people? Maybe give an example.
Absolutely, I would love to. So let's say we are in a place of caloric deprivation. We're not getting enough to eat, and our body is being physically compromised. And again, kind of to speak to what we talked about earlier, someone's body may or may not reflect those changes, but they still might need to eat more than they're currently eating to successfully rehabilitate. So in terms of like rejecting the diet mentality or diet culture, there's usually some rules in their mind that are keeping them in this box. So maybe it's carbs are the enemy. Maybe they used MyFitnessPal and we're only told to consume 1,200 calories a day. So we might look at what the actual research says to challenge those thoughts, or what the actual facts are. Sometimes I tell my clients, you're not a robot, like where does this 1,200 calories a day come from, right? Like here's what we know is so cool about your body, that different days it needs different amounts of nutrition. Also 1,200 calories a day is about what a toddler eats. And I think you need more than a 2-year-old. Like, we kind of talk about things in that way to hopefully start to challenge some of those really, really concrete thoughts. In terms of carbohydrates or other food rules, another really great saying is your stomach doesn't have eyes. So when we're digesting foods, does your body really know whether it's getting its carbohydrates from a sweet potato or a piece of bread? Not really. That's all this like mental judgment. And is that serving you right now? So we kind of get to have these really cool conversations, look at nutrition in hopefully a really neutral way. And then again, because the patient or the client's in the driver's seat, they get to make the best decisions for them. based on our conversations and hopefully help heal that relationship with food.
Oh, that's really nice. And as it seems like, I mean, I know for myself, I get so entrenched with, my worldview, and so it seems like that would be a difficult process, a long process. Could you speak to like the major obstacles folks face? I mean, I've heard people facing anorexia. Anorexia is just a hard eating disorder to kick. Would you maybe speak more to like how long that process can take? Is it kind of a lifelong process in challenging those beliefs?
Great question. So what we know is we've taken brain scans of patients who meet the criteria for anorexia or atypical anorexia and those who struggle with other eating disorders. And so we know from a biochemical place that they struggle the most with cognitive flexibility. So even just being able to look at something from a different perspective is incredibly difficult. So there might be someone who I can have this conversation with, and they might be like, oh my gosh, what a great point, Taylor. Like, I'm going to start, or like, thank you for giving me permission to do this. In those situations, I might meet with someone for a few months, and then they're feeling like they're in a great place. They call me if they need anything, like a tune-up or just someone who gets it, I think can be like a really common experience. But patients who might struggle with eating disorders, it might not be that simple. I've had some clients who I've seen off and on for years, and it's tough, really tough. And so I think meeting them where they're at, knowing that like I'm never going to judge them, if it's okay if we're still struggling with things we might have talked about 2 years ago, and I just usually thank them for showing up and not giving up on themselves. There's a acronym SEEDS, severe and enduring eating disorders. And right now there's been talks in the eating disorder community of what just like holding space might look like for these clients, almost knowing that, hey, this just might be something that you have to deal with forever. And how can I support you, or at least be in your corner as you try to navigate life in this space? And that's becoming a little bit more common and more talked about. And I think it's an incredibly compassionate way to provide patient-centered care. Obviously, it's very, very difficult because at least for myself specifically, and I can probably speak for most of my colleagues, we want people to be free of this because it's a prison. I like to say you can't have an eating disorder and a life. So.
Yeah. And do you find it's optimal for folks to work with a good dietitian and a good psychotherapist in conjunction? Is that optimal for getting a hold on eating disorders?
Oh, that's a great question. Yes. So ideally, the perfect treatment team would include a doctor who knows eating disorders, which can be honestly hard to find, at least in our community, but we have a couple good ones out there, which is fantastic. A therapist and a psychiatrist and a dietitian. So usually it's a 4-part team. And what's great and what I love about the eating disorder field is the collaboration amongst health professionals. I mean, usually we're in contact with each other weekly, at minimum, like monthly, with what's going on with our patients. So it's awesome.
Well, I'm happy to hear that, because that doesn't always happen amongst professionals in different fields. Oftentimes people think that their way of treatment is superior than others in treating some sort of disease or disorder. And yeah, I think it's better if you get a whole team together of practitioners you trust with different angles. Each piece can be so helpful. On your website, I wrote down, you mentioned 98% of eating disorders, that there's also a major digestive disorder co-occurring. Could you speak more to that? Is there like a relationship between eating disorders and digestive disorders. I know the gut health is connected to brain health. I was talking about my experience earlier, and then from what I've peripherally seen, there's a lot of literature showing this connection. So could you speak a bit to that?
Yes, I would love to. So in terms of like GI health or symptoms and eating disorders, we oftentimes don't know what comes first, the chicken or the egg. So our gastrointestinal symptoms a result of, doing weird stuff with food that makes it unpredictable for our body to kind of know what's happening next. So if I'm in some sort of restrictive binging cycle, for example, maybe I'm not eating enough throughout the day. I come home from work, I'm ravenous, I'm eating, a majority of my nutritional needs in a small 2-hour window. I wake up, I'm not hungry. I do that over and over again. That wreaks havoc on my digestive system. I'm basically training my gut to move really, really slowly throughout the day. Then I'm eating a large volume of food that I'm likely not even digesting while I'm sleeping. And so it would be really, really common for someone to complain of like bloating, constipation, inconsistent hunger fullness cues, of course. And that could be a direct result of the eating disorder behaviors. And then, like you're mentioning, our gut is technically our second brain. We have a ton of brain cells down there that can affect our mood. Is that cycling or feeding into the eating disorder or disordered eating behaviors? So it can be this really interesting cycle. Additionally, maybe I have a gastro illness or diagnosis, and me doing things with food makes me feel better. So if I have IBS, maybe I have all these food rules because if I eat certain foods, I'm triggering something that's happening in my gut, and therefore an eating disorder or a disordered eating develops because I'm basically being reinforced that, hey, I should keep limiting my food intake. Maybe I'm not meeting my nutritional needs, and because my starved brain, my relationship with food's taking on a life of its own. So that's kind of where that statistic comes in. It's like, oh yeah, your body is going to try to keep itself as safe as possible, even with your eating disorder. So your gut might take a huge hit because of that. And again, sometimes doing things with food, if we are unable to get a GI diagnosis or whatever, can be really, really helpful too, So I hope that makes sense. I don't know if I articulated myself correctly.
You did, and it makes perfect sense to me. Before I started shifting how I ate, I would get really chronic, really bad stomach issues, and I actually went to a gastroenterologist, and they couldn't give me a diagnosis, so I was just left, okay, I just am having to live with this, but it was the worst pain that I'd experienced, and I have a relatively high threshold for pain, but I would just be debilitated. It was kind of like Crohn's-like symptoms where I was just like incapable of doing anything when it hit me. And so I completely understand why someone would limit what they were eating. It's like, okay, if I'm going to eat, this would happen. I mean, there were times when I definitely stopped. I'd be on vacation and I know I wouldn't have access to a bathroom the next day, and I would not eat as much, because I want it. So that makes sense. Also the piece of, I know, could you explain more about, I'm curious, the eating late at night before bed. I've heard that that's harder for us to digest food. Will you say more about why eating late, why during the night we have a hard time with digestion?
Absolutely. So gold standards to support optimal physical health and brain health, we want to try to get 60 to 75% of our nutritional needs met by about mid-afternoon. And that would be based on someone who's following like a pretty typical schedule. Obviously, you can move the time back if you're like have weird shifts or are a first responder, things like that. But for most of us, if we're doing like a 9 to 5, by 3 o'clock in the afternoon, we would want to get the majority of our food intake met by, because that's when we're, alive and need to be fed, and we're awake, and in conversations, maybe we're at the gym, maybe we're chasing children. So your body needs to have nourishment during that time. Let's say that's not what's happening. Your body is kind of going into this fasted state, and it's programmed to try to get its nourishment from whatever resources are available. And that looks like maybe some of your fat stores, but mostly it's your muscle tissue. So your metabolism's being stunted. We're kind of like scavenging to get its nourishment. And then let's say we're not really eating much until dinner time. I feel like that can be a common cycle that we can get into in just like the working world. It's like, I no breakfast, a light lunch, and then big dinner, big snack, whatever. So your body's basically lived most of its day. Now we're eating most of your food. Your metabolism's still slowed down from what you experienced the day before, and you're probably going to bed in a couple hours. It takes usually about 3 to 4 hours in a healthy person for food to start really making most of its way through its digestive tract. Food might stay in the stomach for, an hour, then move into the small intestine, hang out there, break that nutrition down and start absorbing it. So we might be going to bed before that process is even complete. And when we're sleeping, our body's not prioritizing digesting and breaking down food. So you might be waking up and that process might be still starting to continue on or start up again. And then people aren't going to be hungry because we still have food in our gut. And then the cycle perpetuates. So, yeah.
So to break that cycle, is it generally helpful to just say, hey, I'm going to eat a big breakfast, a solid lunch, and then just shoot for a lighter dinner?
Yeah, that would help support you in your day-to-day optimally, because you would have probably about 70% of your nutritional needs already consumed by that dinner period.
Yeah.
It can be a really hard shift. I know we've talked about that too. It's like, well, if I've eaten one way for 10 plus years, it can be really hard. So it might look like, okay, let's try to bulk up lunch first, see how that feels. Or let's try to do something a little more substantial for breakfast. And those small changes can make a really, really big difference.
Yeah. And then in, listening to our bodies and how our bodies are responding to certain foods, you said 3 to 4 hours for, the foods to start to digest, but how long is that process? Like if I eat a food that is really hard for my body to digest, maybe I have a food intolerance.
Yes.
Is it something that I might feel like an hour late, like right after, or like 3 or 4 hours, or maybe even the next day? Like what's for people who are trying to be in tune with how their body's responding? What sort of advice do you give?
Oh, that's a great question. So let's say you and I were like out at breakfast together and we ordered like toast, avocado toasted eggs and some fruit or something. Your body is going to digest the carbohydrates the quickest, and it's going to move through that, within about an hour. And then the protein and maybe the fats from the avocado, that's going to take, up to about 3 hours time, about 3 to 4 hours. So different foods are digested at different rates. And so if, let's say, we have a suspected gluten intolerance and we're eating, regular toast at this breakfast, someone might be able to notice that pretty darn instantly. And some people, it might be an hour or two later where it's like, oh gosh, it's in my intestinal tract, I'm having GI symptoms, etc. One of the first things I would recommend clients to do if they suspect that they have an intolerance or an food allergy, there are some allergists who are incredible. They are aware of working with people with eating disorders. So I would send them there, like, let's just get you checked out. Let's keep a symptom tracker. So that way we know, hey, every time I eat this particular food, this is what happens. What can be really interesting is, let's say we have an eating disorder and my patient's telling me that they're convinced they're intolerant to all these foods. Well, your body's pretty smart and amazing. So if my client's been avoiding certain foods for a long period of time, I know that their body's no longer going to produce the enzymes required to digest that food. So this is really common if someone cut out meat, like went vegetarian and starts introducing meat again.
Oh.
So if they haven't had beef or chicken for a couple years and then they eat chicken again, they're not going to feel good. And that's just because their body's not used to eating that food. It doesn't mean that they have an actual intolerance. So we might try something like digestive enzymes. We might just try, hey, let's be consistent with this so your body knows what to expect. So it's almost kind of like this delicate balance or dance of, okay, what could be an actual medical concern and what can just be due to, years or months of avoiding certain foods. So it's again, patient-centered, they're in control. And then of course, if anything is like medically concerning on my end, I might push it a little bit, right? Like, I don't think we're intolerant to all the things, but, we can always get you checked out for medical safety and then come up with a plan so that your relationship with food isn't preventing you from eating a variety or things like that.
Yeah. And that makes complete sense. And I hadn't heard that before, that if you don't eat something for a long period of time, your body's not used to eating. I mean, our bodies are so adaptive, right? And then it would be challenging I've heard from a number of my friends who are vegetarians, they're like, I cannot do meat when I try, or even if they lean more plant-based, I can't do meat anymore. And for me, it's so confusing because meat, my body does really well with meat. Like meat's kind of been the foundation for me in healing from my stomach issues. So I'm just, how do I hold that, But that makes complete sense if you cut something out, then, and I'm really into permaculture. It's a approach to gardening and agriculture, and one of the principles is to embrace diversity. And so whether it's ecological systems, social systems, or even with food, I think that's just such a great goal to, just kind of step away from that rigid thinking of diet culture. I mean, diet culture is so fraught, right? We have the raw vegans all the way to the strict carnivores, right? And there's just these, like a lot of topics in our society, it's so much polarization, so much emotion in those conversations, when I love what you're saying. The truth is, it's just, you got to be in your own driver's seat for what you eat and paying attention to how your body responds to foods.
Right. Oh, I love, right. Absolutely. And I think too, it's not up to us as health professionals to decide what someone's relationship with food or in terms of their therapeutic relationships should look like. It's like, we got to do this together. So
I love that.
Yeah.
Well, Taylor, I could talk to you for another hour here. I love talking about nutrition, learning from you, and it's so clear that you have just so much expertise around nutrition, but also nutrition and eating disorders. So thank you so much for all that you've shared. Before I ask you the last question, I generally ask guests, where'd be a good place to direct people if they want to get in touch with you?
So I'm on the PCS Intensive website, so that would be a great place to start. And then you can also find me at taylorausandnutrition.com.
Perfect. And I'll link that in the show notes. And then the last question I ask guests is, what's a message of hope you'd like to leave the listeners with today?
That if you've never had a conversation about food with anyone in this space, I would encourage everyone to do so. Most clients, especially going through PCS, have never met with a dietitian ever. And so I find that incredibly helpful. I mean, so that would be my one message, is if you've thought about it and never done it, now's the time to do it. And it's also never too late to start having these conversations. I have clients as young as 8 years old and as old as 75. So, I mean, it's never too late.
That's great. Thanks so much, Taylor. I appreciate it again. please press the subscribe button, as well as rating and reviewing our podcast. This helps others connect with what you've been hearing. If you have any questions, please contact us at themindofatherapist@gmail.com. These questions will be kept anonymous. I want to thank Eric Price for the wonderful music you hear in this podcast. Additionally, this podcast was created to provide accurate and authoritative information on the subject matter. Although we are interviewing licensed therapists, they are not your therapists. This podcast is not intended to serve as direct medical advice and should not be used as a substitute for direct professional help. It is given with understanding that neither the host, publisher, guests, or PCS are rendering legal, clinical, or other professional information. If you need a professional, we encourage you to find one. Visit Psychology Today to connect with a licensed clinician near you.